Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Hello, and welcome to another great lecture. So today we are going to talk about color photography, more specifically how to deal with color in photography. Now, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll just kind of like, well, now it's so much easier to just hit a filter and that's it. The filter kind of handles the color. But a lot of times what we're looking for is vibrant colors in everything. But that's not necessarily the case because our eyes have been trained throughout so many years, and our predecessors, the people that came before us, have been trained on film. And so film photography, you couldn't have punchy colors with everything. You really had to choose, and you chose your film stock. There were so many film stocks before, and film stock is literally just referring to a type of film. And so they had a type of film, and each type of film had a different color that it really popped because of the chemistry inside the film. And so those colors that they popped were kind of decided with each film stock. It was a little bit different with each film. Now, because of that, it kind of changed the way that we look at it. And not every single color is as vibrant. Not every single color is as poppy. Now, also, it has to do a great deal with art and art theory. And that kind of bleeds over into the kind of principles of photographic theory. And so we're going to talk about that as well in the lecture. We're also going to highlight a gentleman by the name of Jeff Wall. Now, Jeff Wall is an interesting photographer because he kind of breaks all these rules, and we'll talk about that as well. But really, what I want this to be is I want this to be kind of like a brief lecture, but kind of something that introduces you to the concept and idea of color in photography. And I want to kind of utilize that and integrate that into the assignment and kind of tell you, pump the brakes. We're going to slow down, and we're going to really think about how we look at color in photography and how we can kind of look at the corresponding idea of how to utilize the color wheel. As far as the color wheel, and I talked about it in the assignment, it's slightly changed. It's more of a photographic color wheel that we're looking at. So if you look at a color wheel, it's a little bit different, but I do encourage every class, and I love it because some of my students in the past have actually bought color wheels. You can go to Michael's, they're like $5. You can use a 40% off coupon, walk out with a color wheel, and I may be dating myself with the prices, but walk out with a color wheel for like $3. So I want you to maybe buy a color wheel if you can afford it, spare the time, go get it, look on Amazon. They're not that expensive. It's like 3 pieces of paper connected by a brad, but it will help you get the idea of the color that you want to photograph. And yes, it is very helpful for photography, and I will show you why. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the PowerPoint. So here we go. Hold on. We're going to play this from the beginning. This photograph behind this, or in the background of this slide, is by Jeff Wall. And I love this. It's just so interesting how he does this photograph. And what he does is that he actually stages these photos. So if you can only imagine creating this set or in this room, but a lot of times it's on a set, sometimes it's not, but creating this room with all these lights hanging. Now, granted, I'm sure not all of them are wired. I'm sure only the ones that are on are actually wired, but really think about creating this just for one single photograph. So in a way, he's very similar to Gregory Crutzen, although Gregory Crutzen does these very, very larger than life tableaus. So these grand tableaus, but Jeff Wall is very similar in that he also creates large scale tableaus. But what he does is, it's very interesting. It's super cool how he does it. He makes backlit tableaus. And so what he'll do is he'll incorporate lighting, he'll print on plastic, and then there'll be lights behind the plastic, and it will illuminate these photos. So it's very cool how he does it. Super interesting. A really, really kind of interesting theory here, but it's posed candid. Now, posed candid is kind of like an oxymoron. It's like jumbo shrimp, right? But posed candid, what that means is that he wants his work to look elegant and unstaged, but it's actually highly staged and then highly planned. So I want you to think about that when you're seeing the photos in the next few slides. Now, he's Canadian, and most of his work is actually set in Vancouver, Canada, although he makes it look so not generic, but he makes it look so much like normal everyday life that you wouldn't be able to tell that it's actually set and staged for Vancouver, Canada specifically. What that generates his appeal. It makes his appeal more broad. Now, he breaks every single or nearly every single rule of composition. So everything that I taught you in composition is kind of thrown out the window, but we can kind of still break down some of those photos with composition. But really, a lot of his work is just so highly staged that he feels that he can throw that composition out the window. So, for example, we look at this. We have two photos that we're going to break down here. So this insomnia photo over on the left-hand side, remember, a lot of his photos are staged. So he probably planned these green cabinets in the background. He planned that man being down there beneath the fridge. He planned this to be a claustrophobic space. But really, you see that man down on the ground. He's kind of in the almost a fetal position, but not quite. It shows his insecurity. His eyes are staring off. The name says it all. Insomnia. He can't sleep. He's laying on the kitchen floor, still can't sleep. But then he has this kind of like this very strange setting where you have that ashtray on the table. You have that table, that kitchen table in that awkward position where you know that fridge won't open. And then so your mind is making all these instant calculations. Remember, all those decisions that your mind is making before you're even realizing it. And it's making you feel uncomfortable because you know that fridge won't open. You know that space is very small. Those cabinet doors are open. And it's just all a very, very tight and confined space. And so it's meant to make you feel uncomfortable. But if you also notice, remember I said he breaks almost every rule of composition. In this image, he's kind of following a lot of rules. And how he's doing that is that you have, let me go ahead and bring up my, my annotate tool. You have over here, the rule of thirds, if we break that up right there, and you see that the photographer, Jeff Wall, is following a lot of these rule of thirds rules. And those rules are actually that he has this horizon line, this kind of implied horizon line, the corner of the room, essentially, over on that bottom horizon line. And then he has the main subject over here in this bottom third. Remember that Fibonacci spiral comes down and shoop, comes around and then matches right there to the eye of the person. Now, the reason we're selecting Jeff Wall for this talk is not necessarily because of his composition, because his composition will change. However, it is because of his color and his choice of color, because he makes these large scale tableaus, because he's making all these great giant images, because he's making all these things staged. Then what's happening is you have the color all set. And because the color is all set and all staged for you, then it is very, very, very extremely specific. Now, over here on the right, it is not necessarily as easy to deconstruct. The reason being is that there's a lot going on. Now, if you were in person, what I would do is I would ask you, okay, who is the main person in this? Okay, so you have over here, now we're lucky because this is actually something that he's talked about. And there's an artist talk. Remember, I always recommend artist talks for you. But some people, their eye is drawn to this girl in the green. Some people, you know, their eye is drawn to this person right there, eating maybe like a pizza or some sort of snack. This is, if you haven't seen it, right here down at the bottom, always look at the names of images because it will help you kind of break down what these images are about. If it's a photojournalist image, then you can read the caption. If it's a commercial image, there's not necessarily a name for it. If there's a fine art image, you can look at the name and it will help you deconstruct whatever that image is. But really, a lot of images are tied to the name or kind of gives you a hint as what it's about. Sometimes it's very obvious and sometimes it's not as obvious, like this image. But if you look at it in front of a nightclub, that kind of gives you the scene. So it's a nightclub. Now, this nightclub, what I found crazy about it is that this is a nightclub or the idea of a nightclub that exists. Now, the interesting thing is that it is not the nightclub. For whatever reason, what he decided to do was found a place and reconstructed, or rather had his team reconstruct that nightclub so that he could photograph this scene. Now, for whatever reason, he didn't explain why he didn't just use that nightclub. But this is a very famous nightclub in Canada. I've never heard of it, but this is what I found out about it. Now, what he did is it took all night to photograph this scene. They set it up, built it at first beforehand, and then they brought all these people in, and it took all night to make one image. Now, this one image is very, very intricate. And if you notice, what's happening again is he's kind of using rule of thirds and positioning that number. I'm not going to put the grid on there because we're going to imagine that grid. I want you to start imagining that grid without putting the grid over the image. but he utilized rule of thirds to put that number over on the top right. And then you also have this person over here on that intersection line on the left. Now, again, we have this line down here on that bottom horizon line, but we have this person. Now, I know because I saw the artist talk, but it's a story about a rose salesman, essentially. And the rose salesman, because he stands out from the pack. You see everybody in kind of like this attire that they'd be wearing to the nightclub. However, he stands out because he has single flowers, and I would imagine it's a lot easier. Well, when you all imagine, it's a lot easier to see that he stands out when you see this giant print that's backlit. Now, that's another thing about his work is a lot of it's very muted, but remember that light is coming from behind it and it will illuminate it. So you have this work that's backlit, and he stands out because he's in a suit and he has this bouquet of single flowers that are individually wrapped. And this bouquet of single flowers that are individually wrapped, he stands out and he's on that intersection line, and it's a story of him making sales and really this is his job where everybody else is here for leisure. And so again, he's kind of like highlighting this kind of mundane scenes or otherwise mundane scenes and kind of bringing light to these scenes by making these very large scale tableaus. Again, morning cleaning, something that looks super, super obvious. This is a famous architecture, or rather a famous building, and it has a man cleaning. Now, it's not quite following rule of thirds, almost following rule of thirds. You have this man over on that intersection points on the right, a little bit, vaguely, but really, it's almost geometric in what you see because you see this breakdown over here. Remember what I told you. When you're photographing, the easiest way to make something look good is that you are going to photograph near sunset or at sunset or in the morning when the sun is rising, because the concept is that that sun is rising and then setting. And then as it's rising and setting at noon, right around noon, and I'll say around because, you know, the time of year, daylight saving time, it has a lot to do with that. But at noon, the sun is right at its peak. And then what this is that you can see that this is either in the morning or at night. More likely, this is probably at night. It looks like a sunset scene. It's very warm. And then you can see somebody's cleaning at that time. Now, again, it looks very, very kind of like docile. It's a very simple scene, but it is very staged. If you notice that he waited for the sun to come in at that specific hour, it creates that geometric shape that fills in this negative space. Remember, negative space is essentially area where your subject is not. So even though there is still stuff here, remember that with photography, there's stuff everywhere. And so negative space is essentially where your subject is not, where there may be darkness. And so this light comes in and fills that darkness where it would normally be negative space. Now, if we look at it, this is a very, very muted scene. And if you look at his colors, again, very, very muted, but he uses his colors specifically. He has these cabinets stand out in a very specific manner. It contrasts greatly against the person's complexion, but then again, he's wearing this shirt that's very muted with, or very recessed into the background with that fridge. And then this the chair matches the cabinets over in the background. And then over here on the right-hand side, you see the pizza slice awning, again, with that green, that very muted kind of aquamarine green with the green shirt or sweater rather, that's right there with that girl. So you see over and over again, kind of this echo of color and the muted color palette, because he's thinking about that lighting behind his photograph. But that kind of leads us into the talk and the concept of color and color schemes. Again, I want you to buy a color wheel. It's not necessary, but I recommend it. It may be easier for you. I recommend in the assignment, you click on that, there's a color palette, and look at that, especially for your analogous. So analogous, I'm moving my little zoom thing so that way I can move it over here and I can actually draw on the screen. But if you look over here at your analogous color scheme, we're boiling it down to something a little bit more simplified to help you understand it. But this is, again, leading more towards photography rather than art. But with analogous, you are looking at three boxes, three colors that are next to them on the color wheel itself. So remember, a color wheel is essentially all these colors mashed up on the color wheel. And then these colors are decided on that, okay, this is what looks good. Now, again, this is not something that we created that said, okay, as artists, we create this, this is what will look good, and we're going to create this as a movement. This is something where it looks good, and therefore that's how we made it. It's a calculation, and it is something that they simplified on a wheel to help you understand. Now, if we look at it, we're going to look at all the colors on that wheel and decide what looks good. Now, for your assignment, we're using three: analogous, monochromatic, and complementary. And what you're doing is that you are taking these colors. Now, again, this is kind of slightly modified than the color wheel that you could buy at Michael's or buy on Amazon or dickblick.com, whatever it is. It is modified to kind of lean more towards photography, lean more towards the colors that you see in everyday life, because we can't be like painters and add those colors in. It would be awesome, but you could do it in Photoshop, but it's not natural. So I always recommend looking for the color in the photograph that you're taking. So look for your scene that has these colors in it. Now, the analogous color scheme will take the three corresponding on that color wheel. That doesn't have to be down here. It can be, but it can be over here. It can be over here. It can be over here. So really what I want you to do is start thinking, what has those colors in it? And so if you think about green, what is green? What's the most green thing out in nature? And I gave you a hint, it's nature. Think about it, yell it out. Plants, right? So if you have plants, oftentimes that's green. Now, different versions of green, that's easy to find in plants. Different versions of green, and also, what is blue? The sky, right? So as an example, you can find somebody against a hedge, have them wear a green shirt, have the blue sky behind them, and boom, analogous. You don't have to overcomplicate it. Think about different variations of the theme. You can have somebody wear something bright yellow, possibly orange, and then have them pose against a hedge, right? It's simple. Lay on the grass, photograph in that scene. You can have them wear green and then have them posing in front of the sky. You can have them wear purple and have them posing in front of the sky. You can have them wear orange and red and then have them posing up against a purple wall, right? Or you can not have a person in it entirely. And so I want you to think about, I'm going to erase all those boxes that I put there. So I want you to think about these three things: analogous, monochromatic, complementary. Now, I also want to highlight that all of these do exist. They're a little bit more difficult as you go on, but triadic is very common as well. But split complementary is very, very, very common. So essentially, instead of complementary, that's right across from the color wheel from each other, the colors, what it's doing is it's forming a tighter triangle. And that tighter triangle is, instead of going to the box directly across, it goes to the box to the left and the box to the right, or rather the color to the left and the color to the right. If you notice in daily life, this is very common. I want you to start looking at street murals. I want you to start looking at art online. I want you to start looking at photography online. Go to a museum and look at photography, and you will see split complementary everywhere. It is very, very common because it's very common and easy to find. However, what I want to do is I want to boil it down for you in these assignments and make them easier. So I want you to simply look at analogous, monochromatic, and complementary. Try to understand the theory behind the color wheel. Because again, these are not colors that we as photographers put together and said, this will work, that's it, move on, it'll become popular, great, sell it, like Mad Men, right? Like Don Draper, yes, we're going to make this and it's going to be perfect. No, it's not like that at all. Because what's happening is that this is what looks great in nature. It's naturally occurring. Our eyes have been trained to see this. Yes, we've been trained to see all these colors that we that we see on Instagram, in commercials, on billboards, commercial photography, photojournalism, what we see over and over and over and over and over again. We see millions of images in our lifetime, probably more, but honestly, all of that is born into photography because it's found in nature. And because it's found in nature, it rolls right over into photography and it's pleasing to our eyes. So I want you to know that going into this. This is not something that's just a concept that we came up with. This is something that is naturally occurring. We're just kind of putting some pizzazz on it, right? Like you may or not have seen Emerald, but I'm probably dating myself, but he used to go bam and put seasoning into it, right? Probably really dating myself with that, but you're just adding that spice to it, that kick that will give it that pizzazz. Now, the types of color schemes that we're talking about, like I said, is monochromatic, analogous, and complementary. Most photographs can be found in these three circles or these three color schemes. I want you to simplify it. Don't complicate it. It differs per style. Yes, like I said, there is a lot of split complementary. There is a lot of triadic. However, there are even more monochromatic, analogous, and complementary. So some people may challenge me, and I say challenge me, right? But I really want you to practice with those three color styles. Go crazy. Go crazy and have fun. We're going to kind of decompress and deconstruct these concepts here. So look at these two images and think about, what are these? What do you think they could be from these three? Monochromatic, analogous, or complementary? Look at the screen. You may be watching TV. You may be looking at your phone. You may be thinking, okay, he's going to talk on and on about color schemes. But look at the screen and think about, what does this fall under? Because this is kind of a little bit of a trick question here. Now, you may have thought monochromatic, but it's actually analogous. And the reason why it's analogous is because you have that great, vibrant, rich skin tone over on the right-hand side. And that falls into all these different layers. You know, you have a lot of people have red in their skin tone, whether you realize it or not, but there's a lot of red in skin tone. And so there's a lot of red, there's some browns and some yellows in there. And then you over on the left, you have the skin tone. She's wearing a green over like night coat type deal, or a muumuu. My grandmother used to wear a muumuu. I love muumuus because my grandmother used to wear them. But so she's wearing that muumuu, but you also see her skin tone. You see that richness in the mirror there. You see the colors from those flowers. So it's analogous. So it looks monochromatic because of all that color on the wall, but just because it's resounding, just because it's a dominant color in that image does not mean that this is not analogous. So this is analogous here. Now we break this down. And what do you think this could be? If we look at the color wheels here, think about it. Yell it out. And if you said analogous, you're right. And how that's happening is it's falling right there on that color wheel. And that on the color wheel, it's falling right there with the blue and the purple and that kind of fuchsia color. It's almost exactly perfect right there. Because you have these great kind of pinks and purples, and then you also have these great blues that are popping out. Remember, these are the aerochrome images that are capturing that infrared light. Now, infrared light is on a different spectrum from what we see. It's everywhere. It's refracting light from the sun. So if you photograph indoors, it may not be very bright because there's not a lot of infrared in your house. However, you go outside and there's going to be everywhere. If you photograph it properly with infrared film or a sensor that's been modified for infrared, and then the appropriate filter over your lens, because it's going to block out all other light except for the infrared light that will hit your sensor or your film. So if you look at this, you see that blue and that purple and that kind of nice pinkish hue. You can kind of get away with pink a little bit. If you're going to photograph with the analogous color, you can use a little bit of pink and then purple and blue. And so that'll give you some great ideas. I say that and I just think of like this great big, you know, like bubble gum, right? With the great big bubble, somebody wearing purple and against the blue sky, boom, right? This is perfect for if you're really thinking about your Instagram feed or your social media feed. You're thinking about, you want to be a commercial photographer, but you want really bright colors. Don't just throw a bunch of colors in there. Yes, there are photographers that do that, like David LaChapelle really amps up the color and the contrast of everything he photographs. But even so, he's still thinking about color schemes with different images. Now over here, these are two different types of images. I want you to think about each one individually. Think to yourself, say it out loud, and what is it? What is it that you see? Monochromatic on the left and analogous on the right. And the reason why it's monochromatic on the left is that it's very warm tones. It kind of a spoiler already in the assignment. If you watch the assignment video, which is great if you did, because thumbs up on that one. But it's monochromatic on the left because it's very muted. Everything's all that kind of brown tone. And then also it's interesting because not only is that brown tone, but then you have brown colors. You know, the rust is brown. The pants are brown. Pretty much every boy's pants in there are brown. And so it's brown and kind of like this olive green, but it's kind of like a muddy olive green in the center. And then kind of looks like this tan on the left. But really what's also happening is that you're using your mind to decompress and think about, okay, I know those colors are that color because I'm used to seeing them under different lighting conditions. So I know what to expect. However, that's also your mind making all these decisions for you, because what's happening is there's this kind of layer, an overlay that's been done on it that was very commonly done in Photoshop. In Lightroom, there's a different way to color grade. If you go into color photography, kind of a little plug for color photography, you'll actually learn how to color grade. You'll learn the newest tips and tricks with Lightroom, because what happens in Lightroom is you can actually go in there and then grade things separately. Now, grading is the process of changing the color and tone and image. It's changing how you utilize that in Lightroom and how you really access everything that raw file has to offer. So this is a little bit different. You know, it's the approach to this is a little bit different now. But what I recommend for your assignment, when you're photographing for your assignment, is look for like colors. And we're going to see that in the next slide here, but look for like colors. And when I say like colors, what that means is that you are looking for colors that are similar to each other. So brown, like, you know, rust colors like that, the train there, you're looking for brown tones. Somebody could be wearing brown. It could be that, you know, the shoes could be dirty, could be the dirt on the ground, or you could go with blue, right? You could have somebody wear blue jeans, they're up against the blue sky. It doesn't mean that they can't have something that would pop out from that. Like they could have brown shoes, they could have, you know, Air Force Ones, right? Something that pops out from that sky, but mostly monochromatic. You're looking for those tones that really kind of blend in with each other, but it's still very, very popular. And you're really thinking about how to analyze your color scheme appropriately. Now, over on the right, analogous. It's perfect. It's almost perfectly what is seen right here. You have that green, that dark green, and that light green, and that blue, that nice light blue in the background. Analogous, those bottom three there. And with those bottom three, it's really emphasizing the colors in your image. So really monochromatic versus analogous, where we're seeing that popping of color. They're falling, the three colors are falling next to each other on that color scheme, right? And so they're falling next to each other on that color wheel. I recommend just go out and buy and splurge on that color wheel. Spend $5 at Michael's, right? Less than a cup of coffee at Michael's, or excuse me, less than a cup of coffee at Starbucks. But splurge and get that, because when you're photographing, you don't have to use technology. You have that tactile approach where you really feel that color wheel and you think, okay, how does it merge and move into that? Now, this is another big one that's kind of like thinking, okay, what could this be? Think about it. And what could it be? And this could be monochromatic. Now, it's monochromatic because it's all those light colors. And this shows a very different approach. Because remember, there's an overlay over here on the left with more of a brown. This is from 2006 to 2009. So this is not necessarily in style anymore. What's more in style is this by Erwin Olaf, where colors are very, very clean. The reason is that technology is improving more and more and more and more and more. This was very popular, 10 years ago. This was very popular in social media maybe 6 years ago. Now what's more popular because of technology, because technology is improving, is actually this right here, where things are more clean, colors are more precise and defined. Again, In Lightroom, when you take a photograph, you bring it to Lightroom, it's going to help you really clean up those colors. So you're looking for light colors here. That is the easiest way to get a monochromatic image. That is the easiest way to look at a monochromatic image, are those light colors. Those light colors will really, really help you emphasize what you're looking for in an image to be monochromatic. Now, over here, this is a very, very popular, very, very famous example. We've seen it before a couple of times. It is called the Afghan Girl. That is the name of the image. And what are we seeing here? I accidentally skipped a couple slides, so you actually saw that, but we're seeing complementary. And so that complementary is this exact what you see on that color wheel. You see red, you see green. Again, I didn't type in complementary onto Google. I just know that. I know what I'm looking at. I know what to show you for each color scheme. And for complementary, the colors across from the color wheel for red and green, this is a perfect, it's a textbook example of this. It is an image that you've probably seen several times in your lifetime, but it is just perfect for complementary. Again, what you're going to do for complementary is you are looking across from the color wheel. So from blue to orange, right? So from purple to green, from yellow to this kind of bluish purple, right? So what you're looking for is across from the color wheel. Think about a line. If you were to buy a color wheel from Michael's, then you can literally in the field go twist it. It will have these lines and it will show you exactly the triadic, complementary. It will give you a cheat sheet for everything. And then you go move that and then it will help you figure out exactly how to photograph that scene. And you can adjust it and think about when you're photographing, my image should look like this before processing, because I want you to get to that point before even getting to Lightroom. So this is a very, very boiled down look at colors and understanding colors in photography. And with that, I want to give you another review. I know you've seen this again and again, but I really, really want to get you to know this, to understand this chart. Print it out if you have to, but I really want you to understand this chart. And first of all, I want you to shout it out. What kind of relationship does aperture and shutter speed have? So I'm going to highlight it right there. And I want you to yell it out. Inverse relationship. It has an inverse relationship. The two of them have an inverse relationship, which means that if you want to keep the same neutral exposure, and that's the important part here. I keep repeating this because there's a different moment it clicks for everybody. There was a different moment it clicked for me when I was learning photography. If you want to keep the same neutral exposure, if you adjust your aperture one way, so if you're moving it this way, then you have to adjust your shutter speed the opposite way. You don't have to think about this chart when you're doing that. Think about the physical relationship between the two of them. The aperture, what is happening when you have a smaller numerical value, you are actually letting in more light. It's kind of like one of those things in photography. It's like, why do they do that? But there's a reason. So you are letting in more light. And so that is a physical limitation. You are letting in more light, thereby opening up that aperture. So there is more light hitting your sensor, hitting your film, whatever you have, there's more light hitting that because you are opening up your aperture. What that means is that you have to compensate. Remember, with your shutter speed, it is in terms of 1 second. So that numerator, that 1 is actually a second. The denominator is what changes. So whenever you have 60, 125, 250, it is in fractions, right? So 60th of a second, 125th of a second, 250th of a second, right? So if you increase your denominator, so increase that number, your number is actually getting smaller, which means that the time is actually shrinking down. And so that aperture, as you open it up, then what you're going to have to do is compensate by making that number smaller for your shutter speed, making it faster. So thereby making it faster. So the smaller the number, so from 60th to 125th, 250th, 500th, 1000th, that is making it faster. So that is a time-based limitation or time-based restriction. Physical, so the aperture is a physical. So that doesn't matter how long it's open or how long it's closed, right? Because it is a physical limitation. Your shutter speed is a time-based limitation. So what it does is you open up the shutter speed, and what you're going to do is you're going to close it down faster. So if you're opening it up, and this is to keep the same neutral exposure. Now, that sounds all very complicated, but I'm boiling it down for you, and I always boil it down for you into stops. And that is the amazing thing about photography, is that all these advanced calculations have been figured out for us. And now each one of these that you see, one there, one there, one there, one here, that is a stop, which means that if you want to keep the same exposure, and this is the cool thing about photography, keeping the same exposure, you go f8. If you go from f8 to 5.6, then what you are doing is you are doubling the amount of light that's coming into your aperture, and you have to have the amount of light that's coming into your shutter speed to keep the same exposure. That's the important part here, to keep the same exposure. Then you will move over to, I'm going to go ahead and clear all of this up here so it's not confusing. Then you are moving over one stop to compensate. It takes something that is pretty darn complicated. All of these calculations, if you were to calculate light, right, that's very complicated. So it takes all those complications and then takes it and then simplifies it to addition and subtraction. So if you add a stop over here, so add a stop of light, remember, add a stop. So smaller the number, smaller the numerical value, the more open your aperture is. You're adding a stop, you have to take it away from the shutter speed, right? And so that is the relationship between this. Every time that I bring this chart up, I'm going to highlight a different thing, and I'm going to get a little bit more advanced with each one. Now, coming up, you're going to see also a lecture on motion versus shutter, and that's going to help you a lot with understanding this chart, and it's also going to help you a lot with practicing that. So make sure to do this, make sure to have fun, and make sure to keep shooting, okay? I really want you to keep shooting. And this is definitely one of the more creative assignments. I really want you to have fun with the creativity in this class. Make sure to enjoy yourselves and then practice, okay? Make sure to also do your discussions, complete your discussions, as it will also help your grade, and it will help fortify the knowledge that you learn in these lectures and in the books if you bought the books to read. If you have any questions, feel free to always email me, because I am always here for you, okay? So I will see you guys soon in another lecture. Bye, guys.